Aimée Crocker was an American heiress, mystic and adventuress who caused a sensation for her fascinating, uninhibited and lascivious lifestyle. She spent most of her fortune travelling the world and claimed to have married over 12 times. But was her life all party and pleasure? Or was there a dark secret behind the tale of this eccentric heiress? Join me to find out. Aimée Isabella Crocker was born in the city of Sacramento in California on the 5th of December 1864. Her first name was originally spelled Amy A-M-Y, though she began spelling it as A-I-M-E-E in later years to sound more avant-garde. She came from a large family, in which she was the sixth of 7 children. She received an elite education by the standards of the time, but we must remember that this was a society still in development in California in the 1860s and 1870s. The United States had only acquired the region from Mexico in 1848, at the end of the US-Mexican War, and large-scale Western settlement kicked off a year later following the discovery of gold seams in the region. Aimée's story must be understood in light of her privileged background. The Crocker family were extremely wealthy. Her father was Edwin B. Crocker, a prominent lawyer and sometime politician from New York, who moved his family out to Sacramento in the mid-1850s, not long after marrying his second wife, Aimée's mother, Margaret Rhodes. Edwin's brother, Aimée's uncle, was Charles Crocker, who subsequently became one of the so-called Big Four investors, who financed the creation of the first transcontinental railroad. In the 1860s, this laid down railway lines from Iowa in the Midwest all the way to San Francisco, thus connecting the US rail network from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. Edwin acted as legal counsel to the Big Four in the company and was given shares, so he became an extremely wealthy man. When he died in 1875, Aimée was just 10 years old, and she inherited $10 million from him, a sum equivalent to upwards of $300 million in today's money. Thus, during her life, Aimée never had to worry about money. One of the most defining aspects of Aimée Crocker's life, and certainly one which generated an abundance of press speculation, was her tumultuous and colourful love life. This started early. As a teenager, Aimée's attraction to boys concerned her mother, and she soon shipped her wayward daughter off to Europe, thinking that some old world influences might cure her of her maladies. It had just the opposite effect. While attending an elite school in Germany in the early 1880s, Aimée began a fling with a German prince, one which resulted in her first marriage proposal. Yet, the wedding was avoided when Aimée eloped with a Spanish bullfighter. It was an early statement about her freewheeling style and chaotic personal life. Back in California, after her first overseas adventure, Aimée married Richard Porter Ashe in 1882, when she was just 17. He was the 21-year-old nephew of David Farragut, the first ever Admiral of the United States Navy, and a decorated hero of the American Civil War. But the marriage was a dramatic one from the beginning. During their honeymoon, a train they were on derailed, leading to an emergency abandonment of the carriages. A year later, they had a child named Alma, who became the source of a bitter divorce battle as their marriage collapsed on the back of Ashe making hugely speculative financial investments and losing a vast sum of money gambling in the mid-1880s. The court proceedings made national news. Eventually, the judge found in favour of Richard, claiming he was the less irresponsible of Alma's 2 eccentric parents. Eventually Alma, whose name was changed legally to Gladys some years later, was adopted by Aimée's mother and largely raised by her. Aimée decided to get away from California following the chaotic collapse of her first marriage. She headed west this time, taking a ship from California to the Hawaiian Islands in 1888. These were not yet a part of the United States, though American businessmen were beginning to play a major role in its affairs, largely so they could dominate the fruit industry there. She soon met with King Kalakaua of Hawaii, the last king of the islands, and known as the Merry Monarch. They knew each other since 1881, when Aimée, who was 16 years old at the time, had met the Merry Monarch during his state visit across Europe. Thus, Aimée was received generously upon her arrival in Honolulu, and granted the title of Princess Palaikalani. The king even gifted her an island of her own, though it was one of the smaller, largely uninhabited islands of the archipelago. It was while in Hawaii that Aimée met and married her second husband. Henry Mansfield Gillig was a sea captain, explorer, sometime magician, and opera singer. In short, he was the perfect sort of eccentric and colourful character for Aimée to marry. The visit to Hawaii was otherwise a scandalous one. Aimée appalled the local missionaries who had come in great numbers to convert the natives to Christianity, at one time making a bet in Honolulu that she would run around the city centre naked. She won the bet, and even stopped in the middle of it to try and convince a string band that she came across to accompany her. Afterwards, the missionaries demanded that the king expel her from the islands, which he refused to do. In the end, when she left, it was for her and Henry to head east to tour the far east of Asia, though they would return on several occasions to Hawaii. Between 1889 and 1894, Aimée and her second husband went on a huge odyssey around the Pacific world. This brought her to China, Japan, Hong Kong, Borneo, India, and other numerous places besides. If her own accounts of these years, written in her memoir and several other pieces she wrote, are to be believed, and no one has ever presented evidence to suggest that she was anything other than truthful in her recollections, then she had some bizarre adventures during this time, avoiding some cannibalistic headhunters in the East Indies, experiencing overzealous knife throwers in the city of Shanghai in China, and even allegedly surviving a poisoning attempt in Hong Kong. In the British island colony, she also hung out at an opium den, and claims to have purchased a prostitute's freedom. Unsurprisingly, Henry was not always able to keep up with his wife, and he sometimes returned to California to rest and recuperate while she continued to travel. It was during these years too that she began collecting exotic items such as pearls, gemstones, Chinese vases, statues of the Buddha, and much else. She also became one of the first women in the Western world to have a series of tattoos, something which was still very much a nativist tradition in some parts of the world in the late 19th century. Aimée and Henry settled down in the mid-1890s after she returned to California. They headed east and settled in New York, but the marriage soon began to fray, and they divorced in 1900. Henry had been well aware for many years of Aimée's serial infidelity, and while travelling in the Far East, with or without her second husband, she had several affairs. Indeed, many years later she would claim that if Western laws and Christian traditions were not applied, she had actually married over a dozen times, as some of those with whom she was engaged in relationships in the Far East in the 1890s had theoretically married her in polygamous exchanges of vows. In New York in 1901, she entered into what might be considered her most stable and loving marriage. Jackson Gouraud was a songwriter and an eccentric bohemian just like Aimée. For instance, together they founded a Buddhist colony in New York, hardly an unusual pursuit for many residents of the Big Apple today, but something which would have been very unusual to observers at the dawn of the 20th century. Together the couple became a well-known pair around Manhattan, were recurrent attendees at Broadway plays, and close acquaintances of some of the city's literary figures. Enrico Caruso, arguably the most famous opera tenor of the Gilded Age, was a friend and visited their house regularly, where they held soirees attended by the city's cultural classes. Details of these often appeared in the New York newspapers, with salacious details of their lives being a regular topic of the city's gossip columns. Because of this lifestyle, the pair was shunned by much of New York high society, including some members of Amy's extended family. The public, however, was mesmerized by this eccentric heiress, who had so many adventurous stories and crowds of young male admirers. The Philadelphia Inquirer even named her the most fascinating woman of her age. Aimée and Jackson did not have any biological children, but they adopted 3 children, 2 girls named Dolores and Yvonne, and a boy named Reginald. Aimée would separately adopt another daughter, Yolanda, years later, while she also reconnected with her biological daughter, Gladys. Their harmonious, yet always interesting family bliss came to a tragic end in 1910, when Jackson died from complications resulting from a severe case of tonsillitis. Despite remarrying in later years, as you'll see, Aimée kept the name Gouraud for the rest of her life. Following Jackson's death, and owing to both it and the manner in which her every action had come to be scrutinized by the New York press, she relocated to Paris. The City of Lights was already well established as the cultural capital of the world by the early 1910s, and would continue to hold that position for another quarter of a century. She would live here for the next 27 years, though visiting the US regularly. Some of her many acquaintances in the French capital included the painter Henri Matisse, the sculptor Auguste Rodin, and the writer and general literary critic Jean Cocteau, while also doubtlessly crossing paths with other American expats in Paris in the 1920s, such as Ernest Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. She continued to have a colourful love life, one which matched the press's declaration of her to be the Queen of Bohemia. With all this attention about her fascinating lifestyle, she would later write, "I believe absolutely that living, in the completest sense of that word, discovering the full beauty of living and plunging oneself utterly into the human beings that swarm through this life, is a pure art. It is, I honestly think, the highest artistic accomplishment we can hope for. All the recognized arts, your paintings, your sculpture, your music, your books, all those things are only the symbols of that higher art, living." In the mid-1910s, her home in the city, nicknamed the House of Fantasy, became a refuge for Russian aristocrats fleeing the outbreak of the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union back home. She even married 2 such émigrés, the first being the young Prince Alexander Miskinov in 1914. This would cause a huge international scandal, as he ended up having an affair with her adoptive daughter Yvonne, who was just 15 years old at the time. Following this, Aimée quickly sued for divorce. The marriage ended in 1916, and it would be another 9 years until she married her next suitor, Prince Mstislav Golitsyn. She was in her early 60s when she married the 26-year-old Golitsyn in 1925. The union only lasted 2 years, partly owing to the age difference, but also because Aimée continued to treat monogamy as a theory rather than a principle. She regularly attended events in the city with one of her favourite companions, a boa constrictor snake. On occasion, she socialised with Aleister Crowley, already by then a well-known proponent of magic, esoteric knowledge, and a libertine lifestyle. Apparently, Crowley would propose to Aimée nearly every time he saw her or wrote to her, and maintained a graphic description of their decade-long liaison in his journals. After her final divorce in 1927, Aimée did not remarry. She continued to live in Paris for many years, though the city began to lose its status as the global centre of Bohemianism in the 1930s after the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression brought the debauchery of the 1920s and the jazz era to an end. She gradually began spending more time back home in the United States in the 1930s, and it was during these years that she began compiling her reflections on her life into a book-length memoir. This was published in 1936 under the title "And I'd Do It Again." It provides a striking account of her life, the often bizarre situations she found herself in, and her uncompromising approach to life. It makes for good reading, even nearly a century later. By the time "And I'd Do It Again" was published, Aimée was largely living back in New York City. Her health was declining, and she was now into her 70s. She died on the 7th of February 1941, aged 76. Her remains were taken to California, where they were interred in the Crocker family plot in the city's historic cemetery. Having requested cremation, her remains were placed in an urn along with those of her third husband, the only one of her marriages which didn't result in divorce, as he had died while married to her. Unsurprisingly, given her eccentric life, something had to happen even in death, and the urn was stolen some time after her internment there. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Aimée Crocker. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of her life down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and the notification is turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.